The first of our Holy Fathers, the Lord Jesus Christ, thy God, have mercy on us. In giving birth, thou didst preserve thy virginity, and thy mission, thou didst not forsake the world of Theotokos. Thou wast translated into life, for thou art the mother of life, and by thine intercession, save our souls from death. The prayers of our Holy Fathers, the Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us. Amen. Well, hello everyone. Glad to be back with you again, and happy to revisit this new book that we've just started. Hopefully, you have got a chance to maybe peek at it a little bit. It's a very short work, as I said last week. And the book is called, I don't have a physical copy, I'm using an online copy, but it's called Way of the Ascetics by Tito Colliander, who I gave his biography last time that we talked. So if you're interested, go back, listen to that homily if you missed it, and kind of get refreshed on who he is, and a little bit about the purpose of why this book. The only thing I'd like to do today, I think we'll probably just look at, probably two short chapters. All of the chapters in this book are very, very short, like a few pages. And I'm just going to recap a little bit about what we said for chapter 1, just because for a few extra weeks, and we'll just kind of situate ourselves again. So, the very beginning of his work, he begins as we just began, which is with prayer. And we talked about the importance of beginning this work of growing in the commandments, in living the spiritual life, making those kinds of resolutions, that the place to begin is in prayer, the place to end is in prayer. And we use prayer as sort of a rope in the dark that we cling to as we walk along those 2 points. But he immediately follows that prayer with a call to action. And we spent some time talking about that, the importance of not just kind of sitting back and waiting for things to happen on our own, but rather taking the initiative, that, that we've already been called by God. And the next stage for us is to respond to that call in action, and not sort of put it off to say, well, when my faith is stronger, then I can do these things. Or, when I have more time, then I can devote myself to the spiritual life. Rather, it's just one baby step after the next, and we got to set to it right away. And so this is what he says. Begin with prayer, he does, followed by this sort of call to action. And then he just says resolve to start and don't put it off. And that's sort of the main place to begin with. If we're going to turn over a new leaf, we just have to do it. We're not talking about it endlessly. I mean, sure, we can kind of give ourselves that pep talk, as it were. But then when the moment comes, we have to stop thinking about it and just start doing it. And even if we do it poorly, and even if we're not doing it well and we're struggling, it doesn't matter. It's just one little step after the other. Because the only way that we're going to arrive at our destination is if we start walking. And so that's where he begins, and that's where we want to begin with this work, this whole work, which, again, is a very daunting title, Way of the Ascetics. But as you'll see as we go through, what he's trying to suggest is the little things of the day in and the day out, that is the ascetic life. And that for all of us who are struggling and striving to live the faith, whether we live it in the world, whether we live it in a monastery, whether we live it in all of the various difficult situations in our lives, we are called to be ascetics because we are called to take these small steps day in and day out. That's what will make a person truly an ascetic, a person who exercises their faith, an asceticy, right, and who struggles in order to take these steps in whatever situation they find themselves in. For now, after we've looked at that first chapter, which is called On a Resolute and Sustained Purpose, right? We've decided we're going to do this. We're not going to put it off for tomorrow. We're going to start right away. Then he builds to the next step, which is important. It's chapter 2, on the insufficiency of human strength. And so he begins by writing, the Holy Fathers say with one voice, the first thing to keep in mind is never in any respect to rely on yourself. And this is an important sort of theoretical point. So we've made the resolution to do this. And he immediately wants to establish the second point, which is basically, you can't do it alone. If we think we can do it alone, we're already doomed to fail. That's not what God is asking from us. And actually, that's what should make it easier to start. Because we're not starting alone. We're not starting in the dark, as it were. We're starting, if we start correctly, in the light of Christ. We're starting with Christ there leading us, with our guardian angel at our side, with all of the saints surrounding us and encouraging us. But we need to realize that we can't do it by ourselves. And sometimes that's a bitter pill for us to swallow. Now, why might he say, never trust yourself, or why do the fathers say? Because if he says the Holy Fathers say with one voice, we could brainstorm some answers. I won't necessarily ask you, but I want you to think right now. Let's just take a moment and pause to think. Why are the fathers so clear that we ought not to rely upon ourselves? Think about that for a second. Think of some ideas, and I'll go through a few that I have. I mean, if you want to chime in with some things that pop in your heads, feel free. I'm not opposed.
Okay, Jim back here says deception from the devil, which is a very obvious and real thing. The first thing that pops into my mind, aside from something like that, is I guess it was St. Paul who said, "Is like bear one another's burdens." Is that correct?
Yeah.
I mean, we got the apostle of Christ there telling us that we can't do this alone.
Exactly. And not only that, we're a body, right? We're attached to one another. We don't do it alone precisely because of our connection to other people. And the first person, I didn't catch his name.
Jimmy.
Right, and his is also true because we're not alone in the good sense, and we're also not alone in the bad sense. In the sense that we are going to be tempted. There are external forces that want to impede our progress, and so both of those are important answers. Anything else you might want to say? Why ought we not to trust ourselves?
Maybe another one. I don't know if I'm going to get this right, the term, but zeal not according to knowledge.
You're right. So sometimes,
especially in the first stages where you have that zeal, or you think you have it, and everything seems so easy, and until you make that big fall and crash burning and realize, and unfortunately, a lot of people give up at that point. They say, "I can't do this." They get depressed.
So think of a young child getting a new bicycle. And they want to learn to ride the two-wheeler. And so what's the very first thing they want to do? They want to run out, hop on that two-wheeler, and go with all of that kind of zeal. But without the knowledge, the technique, without the support maybe of their parents initially, what ends up happening so often, we hop on that bike, we're all excited, and the first thing is we fall on our face. And not only, can we get hurt by that, but there's the danger, that we'll end up quitting right at the very beginning, right? Or that we'll end up associating this struggle with all of this kind of negative aspect of getting hurt or failing or all of those kinds of things. That's another sort of important reason why we ought not to trust ourselves. Any other reasons anyone else wants to sort of suggest?
Also, because of our fallen nature, we shouldn't trust our feelings on certain things in many situations.
Yeah, and what in particular about our fallen nature gets in the way of us trusting ourselves? Anything? Any ideas?
I guess.
One thing in mind that really gets in the way.
Well, I mean, I guess it's our Vicky says ego,
Right.
but
That's the big one. Our ego and
our carnal tendencies, like everything is very carnal at that point because of our fallen nature. After the fall, the results of that.
Exactly. So here's the fallen nature is all of these disordered desires. Right? We're being pulled in different directions by our own nature. And especially at the very beginning of this struggle, if we trusted ourselves, all we would end up doing is, again, like a little child in a candy store, I want this, I want that, I want this, I want that. And we don't yet know how to control all of those things. We don't know in what degree to exercise certain, desires. I desire to pray, but should I pray until I collapse because I stopped eating and I didn't see anyone and I locked myself up in a dark room? Well, no, not necessarily, right? And it's back to this kind of zeal without knowledge, those kinds of beginner mistakes. That's one part of it. But there's this real difficult problem of our egotism, right? Our self-centeredness. Or the vice that comes along with that is our pride. We have a tendency with our fallen human nature to always put ourselves at the center of everything. We're the standard of what is right. We're the standard of what is wrong. We're the standard of how things should be done in the workplace. We're the standard about how things should run in the household. We're the standard about how things should work in the government. All of these kinds of things, and we have this in ourselves naturally because of our fallen sort of human nature, which tends towards selfishness, right? But we also have it because we've spent so much time practicing being the center of the world, looking out for ourselves first, ultimately. Because a lot of people will say, okay, I care about other people, but you have to take care of yourself first. This is very common. It's in the air we breathe in our culture, right? Contribute to us not having either the knowledge, not having the proper perspective, the detached perspective on a situation. We have all these warring desires that kind of get into the mix, and we have the devil fighting against us. Different kinds of things that contribute to why we ought not to trust ourselves. Certainly not primarily, that we should always be trying to ground that in attaching it to Christ, in attaching it to the Holy Scriptures, in attaching it to the church or to the people around us, because it can help to combat this problem of lack of knowledge, right? Because where are the sources of knowledge? Okay, then we can learn. It can help to combat this inherent tendency to put ourselves at the center of the universe. Why? Because by nature, looking outside of ourselves for the answers is automatically putting ourselves in a lower position, not putting our ego at the very top, right? So it helps to combat that. And it helps to cultivate humility when you have to turn to somebody else and say, what do you think? Maybe I'm not right. And so all of these kinds of things are what is behind talking about the insufficiency of human strength and not relying on ourselves. The example that I thought of is when you go to a doctor, you expect that he has a base of knowledge to be able to treat your illness. And the whole point that we go to specialists is precisely because they have an insight, they have a knowledge into a situation that we don't have. And so rather than just trusting ourselves, that's why we go to these people, right? Because they know what we need in order to be healed. And that's ultimately what we're talking about here, right? We've resolved to set out, but we need to recognize where we are. What are our strengths and what are our weaknesses? Because if we're not very cognizant of those things at the outset, we can be overcome because we have unrealistic expectations for ourselves in terms of what we can accomplish, or we can, be overcome on the other side by, feeling discouraged by feeling we can't do anything because we end up failing. And the reason we ended up failing was just because we didn't set out understanding that not trusting ourselves is the first place to begin. Getting in that habit of cultivating humility, ultimately, right? And asking for advice and looking for it. And so he says, in the work, Tito says, the warfare that now lies before you is extraordinarily hard. And your own human powers are altogether insufficient to carry it out. If you rely on them, you will immediately be felled to the ground and have no desire to continue the battle. Only God can give you the victory you wish. The other thing to realize about why that is the case is because ultimately, what we're trying to do exceeds human capability. You remember the apostles, our Lord says how hard it is for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And how do the apostles respond to this? Well, then who then can be saved? And our Lord's response is very applicable to what we're talking about here. He says, with men, this is impossible. With human beings, this is impossible. But with God, all things are possible, i.e., even the impossible is possible. And in our case, the goal isn't just let's make it into heaven. The goal is deification. The goal is to become by grace what God is by nature. That is something that is beyond us because it's something that can only be given from God to us as a gift. And so because of that reality, even more so, this is why we're insufficient to carry it out. Right? We can't do it by ourselves because the task that's set before us to become like Christ is superhuman, right? It's supernatural, but we're given the ability to do that through the grace of God, through the grace of Christ. So that's sort of, when they hear this, sometimes feel, such a negative view of human nature. We can't do anything on our own. Christ says, without me, you can do nothing. And it's, it's so depressing. And why do we have to take such a downer view on human nature? But it's not taking a downer view on human nature. It's taking a realistic view. If we are trying to achieve something that is beyond human, even imagining, that human beings could live a life that is godlike, of course it stands to reason that only God is capable of bringing us there and leading us there and giving us the ability to sort of do that. So if we situate it in that, it's neither depressing, it's just realistic, and at the same time, we can overcome the temptation of, this seems so difficult. How can I become a saint? How can I become transformed? How can I overcome my passions and my sins and these desires? Well, the simple answer is you can overcome it because God is going to be overcoming it with you, and He can do anything. With men, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible, right? So it sets the parameters, positive and the negative. It sets realistic expectations for ourselves. Joe points out very rightly that this decision not to rely on self is for most people a severe obstacle at the very outset. It must be overcome. Otherwise, we have no prospect of going further. For how can a human being receive advice, instruction, and help if he believes that he knows and can do everything and needs no direction? Self-satisfaction of light can penetrate. And so, I'll ask you, why is it so difficult to not rely on ourselves at the outset. If he kind of says this, why is it so difficult for us to do this? Any thoughts on that? Other than, I mean, okay, we've said our selfishness is sort of one of the things, right? You know, our human nature, our egotism. But why else is it difficult to do it?
Maybe because we've only relied on ourselves our whole lives, right? That we've always, it's become second nature, that we know best, our stubbornness, and
Exactly. So one, we've been cultivating this, right? This instinct of, I got to look out for number one, basically, right? Ultimately, even though I care about the people around me, but at the end of the day, I have to be, concerned about myself first and foremost. That's certainly one part of it. Why else is it difficult to give over trusting ourselves?
Obedient Father, because I'm going to speak for myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I'm scared.
Exactly, right? We're afraid because in the beginning, it's scary, right? It's scary to give control of your life, of your desires, of your feelings, of where you want to go in life, to give it to somebody else. That's a scary thing to do, right? It's difficult to trust in the beginning. Until we establish that relationship, it's a very fearful thing, right? Which is why a child isn't afraid that their parents are going to catch them, but they might be afraid that a stranger may or may not catch them. They'll run over to their parents when they're afraid because they have established a relationship of love and trust. But a child who hasn't had parents or hasn't had that kind of a relationship, when they become afraid, what do they do? Where can they go, right? And this is the same kind of thing. In the beginning, it's scary to trust God because we need to develop that relationship. We need to believe that God is going to catch us, that God is going to be there when the lights suddenly go out and things are really dark in our life. And at the very outset of that, that's a really big challenge, aside from not wanting to give over control, because I don't want anyone to tell me what I need to do with my life. I don't care what the church says. I'm going to do whatever I want during the fast period. I don't care what the priest says. I can come to Holy Communion whenever I feel like it because Holy Communion is between me and God. All that kind of an attitude is all symptoms of not wanting to give control over, not wanting to humble ourselves. But some of that is rooted in fear. Some of it is rooted in egotism, obviously, but there's a whole bunch rooted in fear as well. It's not one or the other. So yeah, I think that's a big challenge in the beginning. How do we overcome that challenge then? What would be some ways to overcome that challenge at the outset? How can we practically start to not trust ourselves, to give over trust to God, if we want to put it in a positive way? You don't have to answer me, but if you want to.
I guess maybe prayer, through starting off through prayer, lots of praying.
Yeah, prayer is a really easy way to begin with some of these things. And the reason why is because it doesn't necessarily require a lot of you. You can do it quietly. You can do it privately. You can do it a little bit at a time. You can do it in any situation. You can do it whatever. You don't have to. It's not like, okay, I have to start going and giving alms. I have to start going to find poor people to give money to. That's a little bit intimidating, maybe, right? That requires a lot more. But something like prayer is a very great beginning. What I was thinking, even as a general sense that's sort of tied to this, is just beginning to do it in the little things. Look, you're not at the point yet where you want to put all your trust in the church and the teachings of the church. You're not at the point yet where you want to say, okay, God, do with my life whatever you want. We're still at the point where we have our grocery list of things that we want from God and we keep asking him for them, right? So maybe we're not yet at the point where we just say to God, thy will be done, we kind of keep pushing for things to be the way they are. That's fine. But find the little things in your life that you can begin with. So start with prayer. So find a little thing to give over to God, like a little bit of your time, right? You're doing that this evening, home tonight. Think, I'm going to give over 5 minutes of my time as a baby step to begin not trusting in myself, not trusting in my desires, and handing that over to God to see what he wants to do with that, to see what he'll do with me as a result of that. And so what I would suggest is the best way to begin to develop this trust, to not trust ourselves and trust God, which is the flip side of that, right, is precisely by starting to do these little things, starting to develop that relationship in the little things. And by doing that, and the more we trust in God in the little things, the easier it will become to trust in him in the real big decisions in our life, in the real difficult struggles in our relationships, where maybe God is telling me I need to walk away from this person, that this man or woman that I'm dating or thinking about having, that this isn't a good relationship, right? But if we begin in the small things, that's a way to sort of see, look, God really does take care of me. I can give myself over to God, and at the same time, it helps with the humility, right? Listening to the voice of the church, listening to your priest, listening to the writings of the saints is a great way of humbling ourselves and sort of, stomping a little bit on our egotism and stopping saying all the time, I know best. Closing our mouth in a situation where we're very convinced that we know best. But maybe for once we could just be quiet and let somebody else have the moment of the person being right. These are all little ways that we can practice not relying on ourselves, trusting in God that when we do these kinds of things, when we make these kinds of sacrifices, God will take them and he will bring beautiful things out of it within our lives, things that we can't really even have imagined would come out of it. But Tito comes to this point that we're talking about in terms of recognizing our own capabilities and recognizing where we are. And he gives I told you at the beginning, I kind of warned you with this. He gives some kind of somewhat hard-hitting or at least direct kind of description sometimes. And here's one where he says, we must empty ourselves, therefore, of the immoderately high faith we have in ourselves. Remember, he lived in, closer to the 50s, he died in the 80s. But he was a contemporary person. He lived in our world. He knew what it was like to have drilled into him that you can be number one. You can be the best. You have to be, successful in life, that everything hinges on that. In this kind of worldly sense of things, especially, right? And all those kinds of pressures we have on us to be the perfect people in every area of our life. He says, empty yourself of that. Get rid of that. At least begin to pour out some of those immoderately high, he says, faith in ourselves, but we might say immoderately high expectations of ourselves. To be these perfect people on the outside and inside to feel hollow, right? And inside to, to feel like we have this darkness or to have this clutter all the time, this anxiety that we can't get rid of because we find a place to feel calm or find peace, right? Get rid of this immoderately high faith that we have in ourselves and in the kinds of choices that we make for our lives. It's separated from, God. He says, often it is so deeply rooted in us that we do not see how it rules over our heart. It is precisely our egotism, our self-centeredness, and our self-love that cause all our difficulties. Our lack of freedom and suffering, our disappointment, and our anguish of soul and body. I think if we do the tough work of looking inside at those areas in our life that we feel the most unhappy about or have the most anxiety about, we can often see that it's precisely because we are unable to do what this chapter is saying, to give it over to God, to really put it in God's hands and say, look, God, I know you can fix this situation. I know you can change this situation. But more importantly, behind that, God, I'm willing to let you fix this. I'm willing to work with you. Because sometimes those are the kinds of things that we struggle the most to actually start working on. And that ties a lot to the next chapter, which is weeding the garden of our heart. When we put off this kind of this interior work, when we put off giving these things to God, the pile seems to get higher and higher, and it becomes more and more difficult to do the house cleaning that would make it possible for us to empty ourselves out, not for the purpose of being empty inside, but precisely so that there would be enough room so that God could come in and transform our lives, transform the way we see day-to-day living, transform all of these things that we right now perceive as burdens put upon us, or difficulties or expectations, and seeing them all as opportunities for growth, opportunities to become stronger, opportunities to grow nearer to God. And so we need to be honest about it, though. We need to look at ourselves and say, where are the areas in my life that I'm the most selfish? Where are the areas in my life that I tend to put myself first all the time, at the expense of the opinions, at the expense of the feelings, at the expense of the hard work of the people around me? Unfortunately, the reality is we all do this. Maybe we don't do it with everything, but there's some area in our lives, right, where we tend to do this. And that's the kind of stuff we want to identify, right? Because as he says, sometimes we don't see it. And if we don't see it, we can't fix it. If we don't realize that we're wounded or that we're ill, how are we ever going to start treating that illness? How are we ever going to get up the courage to go visit a doctor about it, right? Where are the areas in your life that you feel a lack of love? Who are the people in your life that you feel the most tension with, right? By thinking about those kinds of things and then saying, God, I'm going to give this over to you so that you can transform this. And being willing to start. And maybe the place to start again is with prayer. Okay, I can't really think about going and talking to this person and fixing the relationship because there's all this baggage. Then maybe the small step is, in the privacy of your own home, in the privacy of your own situation, just begin to say, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me and have mercy on that person. Starting to transform the sort of thought association even that we have with these people. That when we begin to think of these people that now make us angry or make us feel anxiety or make us feel all these different kinds of things, that we start to join them with prayer and that they can become associated with something very positive within us. And by doing that, I think we can take these first steps in really recognizing the insufficiency of us to, of our own human strength to fix things, but at the same time allow us to turn to God and say, God, I might not be strong enough to do this, but you definitely are. So what do I need to do to begin to cooperate with you? I think that would be a pretty good place for us to begin in terms of making this movement away from selfishness to the point of openness and willingness so that we can say, okay, God, let's get down to the nitty-gritty, basically. And so in another place, he says, if you look into the depths of your consciousness, you meet the same sight. You recognize it readily by the unpleasant feeling you have when someone contradicts you, or he talked about the instant displeasure that we have in this kind of situation. Find out what it is in your life that is causing these tensions, and then try to say, God, how can we rewire this? How can we sort of so that I can get past this and I can make this something that is pleasing to you? These are all ways to begin, right? And so this is all a form of humility, of humbling ourselves, right? Of saying, look, God, I can't deal with it on my own, first of all. We sort of admit the reality of that situation. Second of all, we say, okay, God, I'm willing to be stretched, right? I'm willing to put my egotism down a little bit, and I'm willing to look to you a little bit more. And this is a very practical way to approach the question, or approach the problem, we might say, as we set up, and we'll talk about that next week, but as we set up to move into chapter 3, which is called On the Garden of the Heart, where we actually begin to do some of that house cleaning that I'm talking about. So we've made the decision in chapter 1. Let's do it. Let's not put it off till tomorrow. Let's do it today, right? And in chapter 2, we've understood, okay, God, I know you don't expect me to become a saint today. All you expect me to do is take one baby step at a time and to realize I'm not doing it alone. I'm doing it with you and my guardian angel and all the saints that are surrounding me. That I'm doing it with the teachings of the church and the prayers of the church and the prayers of the people around me and the advice, all of that kind of stuff, right? And being careful to see at the same time, what are the pitfalls? If I trust in myself before I'm ready, I can't help but fail. And that failure is going to be difficult to get back from. The other pitfalls are the temptations from the evil one, right? From the tempter, who says, oh, you don't need all that. You can do it all on your own. No problems all by yourself, right? Just keep thinking about you, and what's good for you, right? And so by seeing these two sides of things, we set ourselves up to begin weeding the garden of our heart in a realistic kind of way. So I just wanted to stop it there and see if you had any questions about that or anything else. But we're just getting into the sort of practical steps of what it means to live this way of the ascetics.
Evlid, Father.
I'm curious. Good. Thank you.
It's a good book. It's been a while since I read it. My question is a little bit different. If it's not relevant, then I'll email it to you. Okay, my question is about state and church, and when the state is doing things that contradict our faith. Okay, and I'm going to be specific because I don't want any misunderstanding or confusion. Okay, so for example, I work in the legal field and I see all kinds of laws and policies being passed so quickly at this point that are in complete contradiction to our faith. And there's situations where we're sometimes put in where we're either supposed to agree with this or we're supposed to go along with it. So for example, in the school system, there's certain things that they're now teaching the children that are disgusting. For parents, and I don't have any kids, but for parents who have kids, there's people that say, oh, God will deal with it. God will deal with it. Don't do anything. Let God deal with it. But you put your kid into that class and they're being taught certain things at such a young age.
Okay, I'm going to hold you up there. I think it's a bit off topic. Let's see if there's some questions that are more on topic. But to make it a little bit relevant, at least to comment on it, the first stage to dealing with all of these things is prayer. The first stage to dealing with all of these things is looking inside of ourselves to judge our reaction, right? And to say, how should I respond to this situation, these external situations? So you mentioned, church and state, but we can put it in any kind of a situation where there's an external temptation on us. And how are we going to respond to those temptations? Well, they're going to be different in every single case. But what isn't different is the process of stopping, starting to pray, starting to ask God for the discernment to figure out, how do I proceed? And that is in practice exactly what we're talking about here. That is not trusting ourselves. So we want to know how to relate to church and state. We want to know how to deal with some struggle at work with a coworker or whatever the situation comes up or something in our culture. Well, the first thing to do is turn to God in prayer, but then look to these sources of where we can put our trust in, like Christ, like the scriptures, like the church, like the writings of the saints, right? And the actions of the saints of every generation. That is the first place to figure out how we should respond. That's a sort of a practical way, as well as prayer. And by doing that, we are making ourselves capable of trying to offer the right solution. Because the reality of the problem is, if we're not in the right state, even if we know what is right and wrong, we can do so much damage to ourselves and to the people that we're trying to help, as we think. How you do it is as important as what you do. The spirit that we do it from is as important as what we do. And so, for example, the fathers will often teach, if we're going to correct a person, but the main motivation, or even at all the motivation, is coming out of a judgmental sort of aspect, then we need to be quiet. Then we need to step back from that until the point is that we can sort of speak about these things. Okay, it becomes a little more complicated in the kinds of issues you raise. But again, we still can look to the people around us for guidance. And by doing that act of humility, a practical act of humility, by turning to the church, by turning to the spiritual fathers, and not acting with undue haste, we're practically preparing ourselves to take the right steps that are needed, but at the same time, we're preparing our hearts in order to be able to kind of engage in that. I think, yeah. So just to sort of, as a way to kind of tie back what you're saying, it's a big question. I think it's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about. But to sort of make it practical, my practical answer is, all the problems that we see going on around us, well, we have all those same problems going on in ourselves, and worse in some cases, right? So we should be twice as concerned about the things in our life that are going wrong as we should be about the things around us. That said, yes, we can't be silent. Yes, we can't allow these things to just kind of go on as though they're not important. Say, oh, somebody else will deal with them. But we need to do things in the right way. For example, to go in like some, deluded terrorist and blow people up. Well, that's not going to be the right way. It might fix it, but it's not going to fix it, right? Because we lose our souls if we do that kind of thing. And so for us, the first stage is always preparing the ground of our hearts, preparing ourselves in humility so that we're ready to take the right action when the time comes to sort of take those things.
Father, okay, so I guess I'll make the question more relevant to pertain to what you're saying. I guess the question is, and you might have already answered this, how do we not become indifferent, self-absorbed, and eventually accepting of certain things? So for example, I think there was a theologian from the States that came here, Constantine Zalalas. I think he said one time, he used the analogy, well, if we see our neighbor's house burning down, are we just going to say, oh, I don't care? And I remember the story of, I don't know if the book is still here, Athenite Fathers and Athenite Matter, where St. Baisus talks about a situation where there's this monk who was going into his cell, and he was praying and doing his prostrations and doing everything and completely working on himself and doing everything he was supposed to do. But then one day he saw another monk climbing a ladder who fell down and broke his leg or injured himself, and the other monks were there helping, and they're like, come on, help. And he's like, I can't, I have to go into my cell, I have to do my prostrations and everything. And then near the end, an angel who he thought was an angel came to him and said, oh, God has seen your effort, he's coming to take you. And he flew out the window and died because he thought that the angel was from God telling him to walk out the window and that he's not going to fall, right?
Yeah. So the first thing in those kinds of situations we need to discern am I being called by God to do something about this? Because if I run, so for example, the one you gave from Constantine Zalalis, you're seeing your neighbor's house burning down, but the firemen have already arrived. But you say, no, I got to go save these people, and you knock the firemen out of the way so that you can run into the burning building. Did you do the will of God there? Like, did a person do the will of God, right? And so we have to respond with discernment, which means we need to find the space in our hearts for God to be able to illumine us that it's clear that we are the ones that are supposed to do something. And so, because the externals aren't as important as doing things for the right reasons and in the right way and in the right time. And so we have to be cautious and careful. So I would say yes. If you see your neighbor's house burning and you're the only one there, well, yeah, maybe you need to run into the house. But maybe you just need to pick up your telephone and call 911 first, right? And so again, the discernment to know, okay, how to proceed. In what order do I proceed? Am I being called by God to be the one that goes and says this, or is somebody else more suited to? In any case, if we begin in prayer, we'll never do the wrong thing. That doesn't mean that the prayer lasts 4 hours. It may be very quick, right? But at the very least, if we cultivate this state of being open to the will of God, in these moments, we can respond in accordance to the Holy Spirit. But if we don't do what Tito is saying here, if we don't begin to live this way of the ascetics in the everyday life and prepare our hearts, we are never going to be in a position where we're going to be able to hear the will of God to be able to do these things properly. And so it's just a matter of getting ourselves, it's like, again, to the fireman. The fireman trains. The fireman, he exercises. He does all of these things so that at the moment when he's finally called to do something, he's physically, mentally, emotionally ready to go do it. That's what we need to do as well. So I guess what I'm saying is we need to focus, as much as we need to be paying attention to these externals, we have to realize that the best way to fix those problems is to transform ourselves, right? Saint Seraphim says, right? Acquire the Holy Spirit, and 1,000 around you will be saved. If we become saints, who knows the kind of effect that would have on the people around us in these kinds of situations? If we were thousands of saints, who knows how it would affect these situations? So it's not to say it's one or the other, right? We aren't like the monk who just lets it happen, but we don't kick the fireman out of the way so that we rush into the situation that we're not called to rush into. And so discernment, humility, and just what we said in the second chapter, not trusting ourselves first, right? Putting it before Christ, before the saints, before the spiritual fathers, before the church, before people around us in general who can give good advice. Other questions?
Just to add to that, Father, something good like a confession of faith must be done in a good way, right? And that prayer must be the filter for our actions. And as like Elder Joseph the Hesychast says that we lose our dikeo when we fight to prove that we are right.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the whole thing. The right thing done in the wrong way or for the wrong reasons isn't the right thing.
Not that we don't confess the faith, but it must be done correctly with prayer preceding.
Exactly. Precisely that. We have to do it in the right way, in the right order, because if we don't, actually what we can end up doing is spoiling it. Right? If this is what we were talking about, zeal without knowledge. You know, we're like the little kid rushing to ride the bike, but we end up falling flat on our face, or worse, we end up causing a car accident because we drove out into traffic because we didn't know what we were doing, right? And we've caused other people harm because of it. And so, it's a fine balance, but the best way is exactly to prepare ourselves so that we're open to the will of God and we're ready to respond to it. Other questions, thoughts?
Yeah, to add to that, or to add, I guess, another question is, What happens when we have the thoughts of, in a sense, these could be good thoughts? Okay, I'm just going to ask it. And how do we know these thoughts are from God or from the devil? Okay, the thoughts, for example.
The simple answer, you don't have to elaborate. How do you know if your thought is from God or from the devil?
Well, I was going to add. Okay.
The answer to that is you ask your spiritual father. Whatever he tells you is the answer. Tell us.
Well, I'm thinking of a specific scenario. For example,
It doesn't matter what the scenario is. In every single scenario, if you want to know whether or not the thought is from God or from the devil, you ask your spiritual father. And whatever he tells you, if you approach him with the faith that God speaks through your spiritual father, you will hear the voice of God every single time.
Okay.
No matter how incompetent he is, no matter how terrible he is, no matter what, because that's how spiritual fatherhood works. That's, as St. Simeon tells us, even through a bad spiritual father, God will work these kinds of miracles. So that's the answer. The answer is your spiritual father will tell you. And if you trust it, absolutely, you will never be led astray, because God looks at that humility, he looks at that faith, and he brings beautiful things out of it. It's when we complicate it by adding in all of our other thoughts that we give room for the devil to work his work that he does, which is to confuse us, to deceive us, and to get us to believe in half-truths rather than in the full truth. Now, that brings you to the point of it's important to have a good spiritual father, but even as I said, St. Simeon says it doesn't matter whether you have a good spiritual father. If you approach him with faith, it's between God and you, just like it's between the priest is the vessel through whom you make this confession to God, but it's between the penitent and God through the mediation of the priest. Same here with that.
Okay, thank you very much, Father. We really appreciate it. It was a wonderful homily tonight, and we're really looking forward to continuing this next time. I guess that's it for tonight. If we're done with questions, if you can end with a brief prayer.
Sure, and I'll just say, so next week we'll definitely do chapter 3, and we might do chapter 4 as well, because it's quite short. So if you have a chance, like I said, it's literally a page or two long. These are very short kinds of chapters, and then you can bring your questions or your challenges or whatever you think. You can come and say, hey, I think this is crazy, or I think it's idealistic, maybe, if we want to be a little nicer about it, right? And we can work through that. I think it's a good thing to do, to wrestle with the truth of our faith, to see why it is true, and that it does stand up to the challenges that we can kind of sort of put to it. But also, if we put it into practice, we'll see the truth. So I'll just end with the prayer then. O Christ, the true light, who enlightenest and sanctifiest every man that cometh into the world, let the light be shined upon us, that in it we may see the unapproachable light and guide our steps in the doing of thy commandments, through the intercessions of thy most pure mother and of all the saints. Amen. Thanks everyone for coming and having me, and for all your questions.
Thank you very much, Father. I appreciate it very much. Kalinikta.
Kalinikta.